Hello, I'm Stephen Fagan, curator of the Sixth Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza. Our institution's ongoing oral history project explores the history and culture of the 1960s, as well as the life, death, and legacy of President John F. Kennedy. This year, to celebrate Martin Luther King Day and Black History Month, we are pleased to present Voices from the Civil Rights Movement, a special series of recent oral history interviews with 1960s activists. In these intimate, detailed, one-on-one conversations, an outstanding group of storytellers share powerful memories from several key moments of the movement, including the Montgomery bus boycott, Freedom Rides, the March on Washington, Mississippi Freedom Summer, the Selma to Montgomery March, and the SCOPE project of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We hope that these remarkable, relevant stories will spark conversation and build bridges of understanding and communication between generations. Please keep in mind that these are full, free-flowing oral history interviews. In addition to moments of technical difficulties, there may be harsh language and graphic descriptions of violence. Viewer discretion is advised. If you or someone you know would like to share memories of the 1960s or articulate how President Kennedy has impacted your life, please contact us at oralhistory@jfk.org. We continue to record conversations year-round as part of this ongoing archival initiative, and we believe that everyone has a story. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you enjoy these voices from the civil rights movement.
And at the start of these recordings, sir, we always invite our guests to introduce themselves, if they would, with their full name, date and place of birth, and just a little background about themselves to get started.
My name is Wornie Reed. I was born in 1938 and on April 5th in McIntosh, Alabama. And I'm now recently retired, just a few weeks ago, from being a professor at Virginia Tech University, which followed being a professor at several other universities in my career. And I've done a lot of different things.
We're very honored to have you today to share your memories with us of the 1960s. If we could, I'd like to start a little before that. You graduated high school in 1955. I know that was a big year for you. You met a couple of remarkable people. Let me start by asking you about the murder of Emmett Till, if I may, and your memories of that, I believe, just a couple of months after you had graduated high school?
Yes. It's interesting, but through the years, as I've reflected on it, I realized that I was in Mississippi at the time. I was in the Ocean Springs, Biloxi area in Mississippi, which is on the coast. And at the time of Emmett Till's murder, it was something that was, remarked on and considered terrible, but considered regular. It didn't become irregular until the funeral. And then it became irregular even later at the trial with the grandfather standing up and all of that. Then it became, but in the beginning, it was not a bigger deal than many other lynchings. But at the funeral with the open casket and the picture appearing on the front of Jet magazine and all of that, it became a big deal. And through time, I agreed with others that that's one possible beginning of the civil rights movement, because that picture inflamed Black America. And so that's my memory of that. I was in Mississippi working, trying to make a little money to help my parents to buy clothes for me to go off to college and so on.
Growing up, had you had encounters with white people that you felt were dangerous that could have led to a similar situation if things had turned out differently?
No, it's interesting. I grew up in a small town 40 miles north of Mobile, Alabama, and that's significantly below the Black Belt. And believe it or not, things were quite different in that area than from along the Black Belt. Things were as rigidly segregated as anywhere else in Alabama. but no one in my town feared for their life. And it's pretty clear to me, as I've indicated to many people through the years, that if a white person had shot at a black person, the fire would have been returned. So, but things were not good, but they were not hostile to the extent of anyone fearing for some harm done to them. And maybe one of the reasons for that is, the main reason I think, is because it was below the black belt. The most hostile situations occurred within the black belt. In fact, in the part of Mississippi that I was in, along the Gulf Coast, no black feared for their life, even in Mississippi, because it was quite different than up in the state. Many people argued through that the reason for that is that the Gulf Coast had many people from the north who were running businesses related to the fact that this was a kind of a semi-tourist area, and things were quite different. In fact, when my aunt was trying to convince me to come over there and spend the summer with them, and then I could get jobs over there because it was much more populated than my hometown, and I was telling her about my fear of going to Mississippi, and she said, well, it was quite different than what I realized where she lived. And she said, this is the first place I've ever heard a white person call a black person Mister. And when I got over there, I realized that she was correct. It was quite different.
As I understand it, in December of 1955, you met both Rosa Parks and Dr. King. Is that correct?
I didn't meet them in December, just later.
Okay.
Later on, I used to attend at least once a month Dexter Avenue Baptist Church after Martin Luther King's spring to prominence with the beginning of the Montgomery Improvement Association and the bus boycott. And of course, everybody participated in it, but I don't take a lot of credit for that, except that I was there, and that was an easy time, really. And so I met both of them. Martin Luther King much more often than I did Rosa Parks.
I know you've probably been asked to characterize Dr. King many times over the years, but give me a sense of what he was like as an individual.
I used to sit in the church and say, wait until the world hears this man, not realizing that he was already traveling around the country and the world was beginning to hear him. I said they would realize that this is something special. I had thought as a youth growing up in Alabama, I tell people I grew up in L.A., Lower Alabama, that I would be a Major League Baseball player, and during or after that, I would be a civil rights person. When Martin Luther King came along, I said, okay, I don't have to try to figure out what to do. I'll just follow him. And then, more particularly to the question you're asking, what was he like? Well, when he walked in, the room changed. He was a seriously charismatic person in the sense that things just were different. He had an aura about him that was just clear from the very beginning. And we would sometimes take his speeches, we being some students at Alabama State where I was in college, take his speeches and go over them because they had some phrases and discussions in there that we just thought were magnificent, like the abyss of exploitation and the something about bleakness of despair and so on. So those kinds of terms we would like. So he was a person who was clearly, in the beginning, somebody else.
You knew he was destined for great things the moment you heard him speak?
But I said he was already great. People just need to find out about it.
Right.
Okay.
Was the bus boycott really your first taste of activism?
Yes, it was. That was the first thing. Absolutely. Like I said, it was easy. All you had to do was stay off the bus.
Right.
And that was made easy by the actions of the uh, leaders of Montgomery, the civic leaders of Montgomery, the elected civic leaders, as they kept um, throwing obstacles in the way of the boycott. You see, at first, uh, the one of the one of the phenomenons in the South during this time was that in every town, didn't even have to be a city, every town of any size would have black taxicab companies because blacks would have difficulty getting rides in the white ones. And so they would have black ones. So in Montgomery, they had several black taxicab companies. And so these companies owned by blacks decided to ride people for the bus fare amount, which was much less than the taxi fare. But after a week or two of that, the city got the courts to declare that illegal. And so after that, then individuals began to give rides free. And I mean, many individuals gave rides free. One could stand on the corner, and within 10 minutes, a car would stop and ask, "Did you need a ride?" And then there would be a short discussion about which way the car was going. And there were so many people doing that. If that car was not going pretty close to the area that you were headed to, then you could say, "Go ahead, I'll catch the next one." It was that plentiful. So that's why I call it easy. And the campus was close enough to downtown that you could walk. And one of my privileges in that walk is that I could walk right by Martin Luther King's house, which was about 5 to 6 blocks from the campus.
Did campus officials frown on students being active in civil rights at that time?
Well, uh, yes and no. Uh, there was not an encouragement for participation from the top because that would have gotten the president fired immediately. But the bus boycott was not started by King. It was not started by E.D. Nixon. It was started by Joanne Robinson, an English professor at Alabama State and one of my professors. At the time, I had not had a course from her. I didn't have a course from her until the next year or so. But she was the president of the Negro Women's Political Action Committee. And she's the one who called a boycott, and she called it for one day. She printed about 30,000 leaflets and spread them all over town overnight. And a very close friend of mine who was had been an Army veteran, was older and was one of her students, and he and another person worked with her all night to mimeograph those flyers, saying, "Let's stay off the buses." They would say why, that Rosa Parks had been arrested for not giving up her seat, and let's stay off the buses the next day. And the next day, as I recall, I'm not sure about this, but I think it was a Friday. And that started a boycott. And the meeting to form the organization that had a meeting that Friday night said that the boycott should continue. So that's how the boycott started, because of this black women's organization that had been pushing and pushing and pushing for the city to adopt what they called the Mobile Plan. The Mobile Plan was a less harsh segregation of the buses. In Montgomery, it was just absolutely rigid. Some places a black would have to go to the front to pay your money and then get off and go into the back to board the buses. In Mobile, they didn't do it like that. Mobile was less harsh. It just was rigidly segregated. Blacks sat in the back and moved toward the front, but there was no line that separated blacks from whites except where they sat. In other words, if the bus was 2/3 black, then they would sit in the back 2/3, and the white would sit in the front 1/3. But in Montgomery, there was a kind of a line where blacks didn't move to sit at all.
How did you remain active beyond the boycott while you were still attending college?
Well, I didn't do much at all while attending college. I can't recall any activism except that my discussions that I had with people and my trying to get friends to go with me on Sunday mornings down to Dexter to hear King preach. And to my dismay, many of the people who were already going to church and were more regular church attendees than I had become didn't want to go. And I was always dismayed at this. How could you not want to go and hear someone talking about some real stuff? And you're going over there with somebody talking about what will happen when you die. And I just couldn't voice that too much around because I would have been considered too odd, but I would have voiced it individually to people when I would kind of complain, why won't you go? I mean, you feel an obligation to go to church. Why not go to this place? Okay. And so a few times I went by myself. And that had a lot to do with my maturity. By the time I was 19, I had decided that I would not believe anything that I had. This is kind of going off course here, but it relates to me talking to you this morning. That I would not believe anything I hadn't decided to believe. And also that I would be like I wanted to be, not how it seemed I should be. Now that was a reaction to the unspoken peer pressure of acting and regarded in a certain way. And a small part of that was that I would go where I wanted to go, if I could, that is, if the segregation would permit it, whether or not anyone else wanted to go. So that's been one of the guiding practices of my life. And it started right there a little bit from occasionally, not often, going to hear Martin Luther King by myself.
After you graduated, you joined the Census Bureau?
Yes, I went to work with the Census Bureau in 1960 as a computer programmer, and I helped to automate. It had already started, but the census had not been collected, so but we had already started. So I went into training to be a computer programmer, and we automated that was the first census that was done on computers that year. So it was a remarkable time, and the Census Bureau was a remarkable place in that people always say, well, you were a pioneer, and I really wasn't. I mean, there were a lot of blacks there, already computer programmers when I got there. And some of them became friends of mine, like for life. So that's where I went, and my activism there was at our black table at lunch. So at lunchtime there was I don't know, anywhere from 4 or 5 up to 6, 7, or 8 young African Americans who were working at the Census Bureau, not all computer programmers, but doing various kind of professional jobs there at the Census Bureau. And at that table, I was always talking about civil rights and providing support to the people who were in Alabama and other places in the South demonstrating, and the sit-in movement had started, just by the time I started at the Census Bureau. And going back to your earlier questions about my activities as a student at Alabama State, it was surprising and even shocking to me the number of blacks who, in the early spring of 1960s, when the sit-in movement started, actually began to sit in Montgomery, including one guy who had been one of my roommates and who was a friend of mine. Whereas I wasn't that surprised at him, but I can't ever remember having had a civil rights discussion with him. And he was one of the leaders. He was one of the people put out of the college. And his name was St. John Dixon, and he's kind of famous in the literature for being one of those students that Northerners had to find a place for them to go to college. So the next year after I finished college, all kind of activism started. But as far as I could tell, there was none other than staying off the buses while I was in college.
I wonder, I'm sure some of those young men that you tried to get to go hear Dr. King speak a year later were probably doing sit-ins and getting involved in activism.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
You were just ahead of your time, I imagine.
Yeah, just a few months.
1960 presidential campaign, Kennedy versus Nixon. Do you remember your initial thoughts of John F. Kennedy?
Yes. I had my doubts about him. What has this rich young guy ever done? Whereas I knew some things that Richard Nixon had done. Richard Nixon was the person that the civil rights leaders would meet with when they would come to Washington, because Eisenhower wouldn't meet with them, but Nixon would. And I knew later that Richard Nixon was a life member of the NAACP. So I had my doubts about Kennedy, but as the campaign went on, I felt more favorably toward him. And the thing that won him the presidency that is not talked about enough, in my view, was him getting Martin Luther King out of jail. And when Daddy King, who was a Republican, as many people like him, blacks like him were, who were educated and likely prominent in the 1920s, 1930s, back then they were Republicans. They just hadn't switched yet, and some people didn't ever switch. Of course, the FDR was the reason that many blacks switched from Republican to Democrat. He announced that, quote, "I'm changing my vote. I'm going to vote for Nixon." And that swung a lot of blacks, and Kennedy won by the narrowest of margins. Now, I credit Bobby Kennedy with that. I never credited JFK with it, because it was Bobby Kennedy's idea. And I don't mean I'm not looking backwards at that. I was keeping up with it at the time. It seemed to be Bobby Kennedy's idea. And I guess I quickly go to the debate. I have never agreed with debates. I seldom watch them, because I say presidents, and I even wrote a column a few years ago, two, 3 years ago, that said presidents don't debate. That's not a way to choose a leader. And of course, Kennedy won also. If Daddy King didn't do it, the debate did, because he looked sharp and Nixon looked ominous. The people who heard that on radio thought that Nixon had won. People who saw it on television thought that JFK had won. And so I voted for Kennedy. And that was the only vote I had. we couldn't vote on anything else because I lived in D.C. Okay. You didn't have any other vote then, and not too much more now.
Kennedy, of course, tried to appeal to idealism as much as possible, get young people motivated and more involved in civic affairs and government. Did you get caught up in any of that idealism living in D.C. during the Kennedy years?
No, I must say that I had a sense of it. My idealism, the civic idealism was secondary to me. The racial idealism was first. Okay, and I didn't think that Kennedy was sufficiently there. In fact, when he gave his famous speech, I didn't think too much of it that year, as I probably should have, where he came out for civil rights so strongly in early '63. I still was skeptical about him. I didn't know whether he really meant that, and through the years I've grown to believe that he did. But at the time I said, you know, you're kind of a Johnny-come-lately. We've had all these people killed, and you haven't been saying, you know, protests and so on. You haven't been saying anything. You're Johnny-come-lately. But I wasn't hostile to him because it seemed to me that his brother Bobby was always pushing him to do the right thing. That was my impression. Okay, so that's the way my idealism. And I believed in the Peace Corps. I thought it was a good thing. I didn't know anybody who went in. I met many people as they came out. I didn't know them when they went into the Peace Corps. And many years later, I was involved in something like that, the whole city year movement that President Clinton, as when he was campaigning for the presidency, copied the AmeriCorps off the city year. I don't know whether you know about that, but anyway, I was heavily involved in that.
Where were you on the day of the assassination in 1963?
Oh, I can remember it very distinctly, as many people can. I was working at the Census Bureau, and this the colleague in the department that I worked in, who was a computer programmer, in fact, at the time, we were in the same unit, the same like 5-person unit, 3 programmers, a manager, and a secretary. Okay, was in the unit. He came back from lunch. He had gone out to lunch. He liked to go out for lunch because he liked to take a drink, even though he was this young 20-something-year-old white guy. And he came back saying that the president had just been shot and killed. And we thought it was some kind of joke. We were waiting for the punchline. So it took a minute or so for him to convince us that it had happened, and we then began to hear it more. So I was there at work, and it was just a little after lunchtime. And so I remember that very, very distinctly.
Did you go see the funeral procession in D.C., or did you watch it on television?
I went to see it. I'm not sure how I got to where I was. So I don't want to say a lot about it, except that the very next year, I started working for IBM on Connecticut Avenue. And the church that the Catholic church in which the funeral occurred was just right up on the corner, about a block or two going north of the office building I worked in. So my remembrances of that area is of when I worked for IBM, but somehow I went to that area and somehow got into some building with some other people and got a chance to go upstairs so we could look down on the procession. So that's how I saw it. and I know that I had not started work there yet. So somehow I'd gotten into a building, and since I kind of went alone to things like that quite often, it was easy sometimes it's easy to get places and go with other people if you're alone. You don't have to ask anybody else, well, do you want to go? You just go. So that has been a great benefit to me to do that. So yes, I went there and saw the procession. I also saw the procession from the White House to the Capitol, where his body lay in state. And just as I should have looked up for this discussion, looked up this corner, but at the corner of Pennsylvania Avenue and the beginning of the Capitol, the wagon, the horse-drawn wagon with his casket, was directly in front of me when the crowd says, Oswald has been shot. Exactly there.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. And what's going on? Yeah. So that occurred, and then I guess that night, that was probably the next day. The next night, I was in a line to go past the casket in the rotunda, but that line was 10 blocks away, and they told us at about 3 a.m. that we were not going to be able to get there before 8. So we should make the decision to go home and get some rest because we were too far back in the line. Okay. And those are my memories about it. I also, to this day, refuse to believe that Oswald acted alone.
Did you?
That comes from my being a Southern boy used to shooting guns. And for a single shot rifle to hit him 3 times. You know, you shoot and then you cock it. You shoot and then you cock it. You shoot and then you cock it. That was incomprehensible to me. Well, they had a sharpshooter to demonstrate that it could be done. So it's possible, but I say improbable, that could be done.
When you initially heard that this had happened in Dallas, a segregated southern city, did you think that it was a white supremacist before you knew anything about Oswald or that story?
No, I didn't. I didn't think that, to me, that would have been illogical. I mean, right. I just didn't see any connection. Yeah.
Yeah. Going back, because I forgot to ask you about this, did you participate in the March on Washington in August?
Absolutely. I was there. And that was a frustrating time for me because the press was full of discussions about violence and the potential for violence and so on. I was just quite frustrated about that because, number one, I said, when, anywhere, was there any violence perpetrated by protesters, civil rights protesters? There had not been a violent one yet. Now, that would be some later, and the violence would usually be against property, not individuals. But there had not been any. And 2 months before the March on Washington, Reverend C.L. Franklin, Aretha Franklin's father, had led a march in Detroit that involved King giving a long speech at Cobo Hall, where he ended it with the I Have a Dream part. And I used to have the vinyl album of that. Um, and there had been no violence. They had as many people at that march as we expected in Washington, which was about 125,000. Okay, and so there had been no violence. They had not expected any violence. It was just a peaceful walk down the street. And so I'm saying, why is that all this discussion about violence? And why is all, because there will be no violence. So as a result of that, I got up very early, and I was probably down on the mall at about 8 o'clock that morning just to catch things. And I didn't bother asking any friends whether they were going because I didn't hear much discussion about it. And I had spent 3 years arguing with some of my friends about supporting civil rights and was quite dismayed that some of them wouldn't even join the NAACP. I used to collect memberships for the NAACP, and they cost $2 a year. And people like my friends who were all college graduates and was slow to provide the $2 for the membership, whereas when I went into the so-called ghetto, I would always have support. They didn't always have the $2, but they said, "Can I give you 50% now?" And a little later, they would be more like that. So I was a little dismayed with some of my close friends, and so I didn't go with anyone. I went by myself. Uh, because I wanted to do what I wanted to do. I wanted to go and be at places that early on to see what was going on, and so on. So yes, I attended the March on Washington. It was very, very hot, and it was and I've talked about it ever since because many people only remember the part of the speech that I wished he hadn't given. To have a dream part. And some of his colleagues, I've learned later that some of his colleagues did not want him to mention that part because it wasn't in the written text. And they said, just don't venture over there. And the reason is they said it was at variance with the whole jobs and freedom aspect of the march. Okay, and I've reminded people that say, when you see this march, look at all those guys around King up on the podium with those little white paper hats on. Who are they? They're union people, because the first word in the march was jobs and freedom. Okay, and so I wish that he had not added that on, because that's all people remember. They don't remember him saying that those of you who think we just came here to just blow off a little steam, you're in for a rude awakening. And so on and on and on. And that speech has led to a mischaracterization of Martin Luther King. I usually give talks about Martin Luther King on Martin Luther King Day and all of that, and I argue that there's an imposter being celebrated because the person being celebrated is not the person I knew.
I understand by the mid-'60s you had become active with the Black Power movement?
Oh, I became active, specifically active in the Black Power movement in 67, 68, during that time. Stokely had pretty much kicked it off in 1966. And I always tell people, if you want to know where I was about a year behind Stokely. I didn't know Stokely personally. I didn't have a personal relationship with him. I had one with many other people, but I was in his presence several times, including the first time I saw him when I said, "Oh my God, who is this young wild man?" So yes, I was involved in the Black Power movement. In fact, I consider that I was in the center of it. I could go on and on about that. So what do you want to know about it? I better just answer questions about that one. So,
well, I'm leading us up to the Poor People's Campaign, and I'm just wondering how you transitioned from being active in Black Power to being part of King's Poor People Campaign in '68.
Oh, I didn't see a difference in that. See, that was the kind of stuff that I was pushing. Martin Luther King was not saying we're going to come um, beg you to let us sit beside you. Okay, people in the Black Power movement had moved away from that approach to civil rights. Martin Luther King's Poor People campaign, he would say this, that we're going to Washington and we're going to stay until they hear us. They must stop and do something about this poverty, this outrageous poverty we have in the country. And it's not widely known, but that he had most minority groups on board with him at the time. Okay, and that they had meetings, and this had just developed, quite quickly as things did back in the 60s. It didn't take years; it was just a few months, and things were in operation. And he had said, "We're going to Washington, and we're going to make our demands forcibly. We will close down D.C. if necessary. We will stop commerce. We will stop planes. We will stop trains. We will be heard." And so when he said that, all of these young radical groups, I didn't consider myself a part of some of these outrageously radical groups, even though some of our ideas were the same. But some of these groups were so radical, they would have nothing to do with King. But when he said that, they said, "Oh, we'll come help you." I don't know of a black radical group that didn't say we'll come help. So they were all coming to help him close down D.C. if necessary. And so that was not really anything different from what I've been pushing. It's interesting, like that same year later, but we can talk about the Poor People's Campaign. I can go into that later. But I even helped to start a Black Panther chapter that I was never a member of. And that would talk about how I went on and did other things in the Black Power movement.
Those early plans, as you say, to shut down Washington, and I think King even suggested possibly strategic burnings of slums or filling up hospital emergency rooms, which I think he characterized as militant nonviolence.
Right, yes.
Do you feel that was a direct appeal to the Panthers and others to kind of bring them into the fold?
I don't think it was intentionally so, but it worked. By the way, some of the Panthers probably were planning to come too, but I don't know whether at that time they were coming as a group, but they didn't have anything negative against it. But I don't think it was a direct appeal. It was just an appeal just that's intended to be very broad and very focused.
You identified as a Black Panther at that time?
No, I never did, even though this office was started by probably myself and a friend of mine who was in another little group called something like the Black Action Committee or something like that of Jersey City. And so we were active there, and we were planning to have our own group. From everybody was who was very active was tasked to bring people to Washington. So we were all coming. Okay. And what's very interesting about that, and we can talk about that later if you like, is that I worked for IBM at the time. and I figured that sooner or later I'll be involved in something that it wouldn't be anything I would do or regret, but it would be something that wouldn't look right to them, and they would fire me, and I would have to go on and do other things. But they knew I was involved, but I made them money. And so I was almost a fair-haired boy at IBM. I was a person that they saw going places.
How did the death of Dr. King in April and then the subsequent rioting in D.C., how did that impact you?
Well, it impacted me all kinds of ways. I can't say the first way, but in looking back, and discussing it and just skipping over the fact of how distraught I was about it, was the fact that I had an appointment with him. I'd seen King 3 or 4 times in that month before he was killed. The first time was on Easter Sunday, about a month earlier, at his church in Ebenezer in Atlanta, where I'd asked him for a meeting. And he said, okay. I said, you just name the place and time, and I'll be there because there's some things I need to discuss with you and get some answers to. And he said, okay. By then, he knew me. He may never, I guess by then he would know my name, but before then he would know me and not my name because I would always be around. But by then he knew me and he probably knew my name. Okay. He knew many people by sight. But he certainly knew me because when I would see him, he would think I would be coming up to press for the meeting. I remember one time about 2 weeks before he was killed, he was in Jersey City I lived in, right across from, because I worked in Manhattan, lived in Jersey City. And he saw me coming up. He says, well, I don't have time right now to meet. And I said, I'm not here to ask you for a meeting. I'm just here to tell you that we're with you and we're coming to Washington. And at that time, he was working 20-hour days. And I knew that it was, that was no time in his schedule at all to meet and talk about philosophical issues. Okay. But something else happened that I need to discuss. If we're going to discuss the 60s, then we need to go back the preceding year, 1967. So in 1967, there was this riot in Newark. This was a big riot on the order of, say, the Watts riot or something. Okay, we had a lot of riots across the country. But 67, that was the Newark riots. And then a few weeks later, there was the Detroit riots. It so happens that I had been in Detroit a week or two before those riots, and I was in the area where the riots started, and I participated in something that kind of was precipitated the riots. That is, the bars closed at 1 o'clock. So if you're a person hanging around in New York, that's just outrageously early, and to close. And so I, along with other patrons, you could actually walk out of the bars with a drink in your hand and walk a few, even within the same block usually, and go down into a basement to a place. I'm forgotten this name we called them, which would be an illegal bar, which would run then for another 2 or 3 hours. Okay, and so I did that, and the riot started with something like that happening. Okay, going down and some kind of encounter with police that precipitated the riot. But before the smoke had settled in the riots, in the Detroit riot, President Lyndon Johnson had established this Kerner Commission. He established a commission to look at the riots, and you know a lot about that, I'm sure. And this was established in the summer of 1967. They delivered their report that we have since then called the Kerner Commission Report in March 1st. Now, there were many people like me, we poo-pawed the idea of such a commission. We said that, oh my goodness, all of these, it was 9 members of the commission, and I could name them now if you're interested because I've talked about them so much, that we're saying this is an establishment group of people if there ever were one. He established this commission, and we said, well, I guess they can just go into a room and spend a couple of weeks writing a report. They don't have to do an investigation because we know what they're going to say. But they shocked us. On March 1st, they came out with the Kerner Commission report, which shocked the country because they said in no uncertain terms. Oh, by the way, Johnson had asked them to answer 3 questions. Number 1, what happened? Number 2, why did it happen? And number 3, what can we do to keep it from happening again? Well, what happened? They assured the country there was not a communist or Soviet-led plot, that these people have their own reasons for these demonstrations and riots and so on. And they went into many chapters on the history of relations with the police to doing it. But they said up front, the reason for it and why it happened was white racism. That had never been stated by any prominent body in this country. And it wasn't stated by any politician of national prominence, like presidential level, even after that, until the campaign, the Democratic campaign for presidency between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, when they began to use the term and point out racism. So this was a monumental task, okay? And I don't need to go into all of their discussions about that, but I'll go to the third one. What can we do to keep it from happening again? And they laid out a blueprint for America. They said, we could do nothing, and that's unconscionable. We can improve the ghetto, and that would be good, but not sufficient. Or we can integrate America. And what they meant by that is not only improving the situation in the ghetto, but making sure that future jobs are not moved so far from the ghetto, and when they are, that there's transportation between the ghetto and those jobs and so on, and there are buses and so on. And they went on and on and on with their prescription. The country was still trying to wrestle with understanding because they could not reject this. Well, the reason is white racism. But I'm always asking people, why do you think nothing was done? Absolutely nothing was done. Well, the reason nothing. Oh, by the way, I probably should say here that they sold 2 or 3 million copies of that report. Okay, so therefore it was wide, and it was front page news in newspapers across the country. So it was not something that was ignored. It was just. And when it came out, I was in the South somewhere, in Alabama and Georgia, and it was on the front page of those newspapers too. Okay, and I'd forgotten the point I was headed toward, but it'll come out as I continue to talk about this. But when I would ask people, why do they think nothing happened? It's so long ago now that even people who weren't born, I ask them to just figure out, just think about what happened. Well, the most significant thing that happened, and that changed America, and I argue it's not talked about enough, is the assassination of Martin Luther King 1 month later, 1 month after the report came out. And that was the end of the report, because the forces that were kind of beginning to figure out how they could counter the thrust of the Kerner Commission report really went to work. They had already. I used to say that they didn't really get to work until the early 70s, but a colleague of mine had shown me through the years that I was wrong. They had started right after the civil rights bills were passed. They had started this work against what I would call racial progress. And there were all these riots across the country, more riots than ever before after Martin Luther King's assassination. In fact, I was still young and unmarried, so therefore I still could go do things I wanted to do. So I went to Harlem to try to help quell the riots. So I was working with the police, trying to get people to come out of the streets. This was Friday night, so King was killed like on a Thursday evening. So this was Friday evening. I'm up in Harlem, and I remember I'm saying, and I'm working with a policeman trying to drag people out of the street who had just sat in the street and so on. And I said, why are you demonstrating here? Why don't you go downtown and demonstrate? And so after a while, things cooled down a bit. So I went off to visit a young lady, and we sat watching on television the news, and the news just full of these riots. But the key thing that happened were these people getting off the subways in the theater district. And they were running people out of the theaters. And I said, I had something to do with that. Trying to get people to get off the streets in Harlem and go somewhere else and ride and demonstrate. So I clearly was involved in that. And just for your information, I went the next morning to Memphis and participated in what we did all the time then. We marched and demonstrated. That was a march and demonstrate. And as I recall, I think Coretta Scott King spoke at this event. So I left there and went to Atlanta for the funeral. In other words, when King was killed, I never went back to my office for the next week and a half. I just told them to cancel all my appointments. I wasn't coming, and I didn't have to explain. They knew I was involved. And they knew that King was, my leader and significant part of that. And so I went and I actually attended the funeral. Okay. Both the one at the church and the one later at Morehouse campus. But his death unleashed all these anti-civil rights forces to redefine things. They said, see, the problem is violence. And so what we need to do is control this violence. And I argue that was the beginning of the militarization of the police departments in this country. And that was the end of talking about changing America to because of its racism. That was, you couldn't even talk about that. Okay, unless you were, like people in my groups and so on. So it really changed America, the killing of him, because that would have been, I don't know what would have happened, but there would have been more serious discussions about what we should do in this country. So that's my reaction to King's killing.
You mentioned a moment ago being in the South in 67. I'm curious, since you grew up there, when you would go in 66, 67 and beyond, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, were you seeing concrete change from the life you had lived growing up?
Yes, and I can give you a specific example. So I'm down there visiting my parents in 1965. Okay. Presumably, I think it was after the Voting Rights Act had been passed. Okay. And there was a person running for sheriff of the county who was at our house. He might have been there when I got there. All I remember is, I don't remember him coming. I remember him being there, and I remember encountering him, being introduced to him. But he was there spending a lot of time. He spent so much time at our house that he ate dinner with us. He was running for sheriff, and he wanted my father's support. And by then, my father was one of the leading black figures in town, just because, my father was not a prominent person or an educated person, but he was a very, very smart person who was a skilled worker who had kind of privileged jobs because he was so good at what he did. And And so he was there to seek my father's support. See, seeking my father's support, and my father came out publicly, that would be, significant. So that it was already happening. Okay. I shouldn't go off into other things, but sometimes that same year, I was on a bus, which 40 miles between my hometown and Mobile, and I sat in the second row, a Greyhound bus, and I sat beside this smallish white man who resented immensely my sitting beside him. Okay, so he tried to push me and make me uncomfortable, and I told him to stop. And you gotta understand, I'm in my 20s. so I could beat up a person like him. Okay, as long as I don't let him come out of his pocket with anything. So he put his hand in his pocket, and I grabbed his hand. And we tussled for a while, and I yelled to the bus driver. I didn't have to yell far. Remember, I was on the second row. That he should stop and take care of this because this guy was acting inappropriately. And the bus driver ignored me. And so after about 10 minutes of that or so, because it was pretty clear I wasn't going to turn his hand loose. I was never, ever, not alive, going to allow him to come out of his pocket. Because in the South, I can't let a person come out of their pocket because if he's reaching in there, it's either a long knife or a gun. So, and I couldn't deal with any of those. I had to deal with him without those. So this white woman sitting on the front row, she came over and said to me, "Sir, would you change seats with me?" And so I went up to the front row, and she sat beside him. So that was I guess he hadn't changed yet, but I had changed my behavior.
Mm. Taking a step back from that, with civil rights on one side and Vietnam on the other, how would you assess the legacy of Lyndon Johnson? How do you feel about him today?
Now you put that in a very interesting way, because to this day, I would argue that Lyndon Johnson is on racial issues is in a class with Abraham Lincoln, if not in front of him. I would argue that Lincoln was forced. Johnson wasn't on things racial. So I give him as the highest possible praise. I have I had a long history, long for that time because things happened fast, of being against the Vietnam War. In fact, I used to go down to the Senate and sit in the gallery and hear the arguments on the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Bill and all of that. And so in '64, during the discussion of the Civil Rights Bills, often Senator Wayne Morris would stand up and start talking about this horrible situation we were in Vietnam, and we needed to stop it. And so he convinced me, and at one point I knew only two people who were against the war in Vietnam, and that was Senator Wayne Morris and Wornie Reed. So I was against it for a long time. It wasn't as clear to me as things went on then how I didn't think we had any business there. I thought the people should have been able to have whatever kind of government they wanted, and that we had no business there. And this whole domino thing they were arguing against, I didn't particularly think was reasonable enough for us to get involved in a civil war there. But I didn't know until later the extent to which Lyndon Johnson lied. I knew a little about it because people would mention it then. So it's at worst a toss-up, because 55,000 lives killed over there. So that's a terrible thing. And Johnson was a complicated figure. For example, in 1964, he made sure he did the best he could to keep the Freedom Democratic Party of Mississippi from being seated, because he didn't want anything to disrupt his careful march to re-election. And so he was kind of complicated. He went out of his way to do that. And there was another complicated figure involved in those days that I admired, and that was Adam Clayton Powell. He tried to stop them too. Okay, and I admired Powell a lot. Okay, so there are people that I admire who are kind of complicated, and Lyndon Johnson was one of them. So he was so significant for the civil rights bills and all, and then the Great Society programs, that I would say he's still a big plus in my view.
Let me bring us back to the Poor People's Campaign. Tell me a little bit about Resurrection City, your experiences there.
Okay, so when King was killed, there was a resolve to continue the campaign, and one part of it succeeded, and that is bringing people to Washington to inhabit Resurrection City. So as many people eventually came and were inhabitants there as Martin Luther King had planned. Okay, so that's one thing that happened. So I would every couple of weeks I would take 2 or 3 days off and go down from IBM to go down there to participate in things in Resurrection City. And I remember one Sunday morning, I was on this dump truck, which was a garbage truck. And so I was on the garbage detail. And I was thoroughly involved with Resurrection City. I was in and out of there. I was impressed with a local but nationally kind of prominent rhythm and blues singer who had a tent there. His name was Billy Stood. Okay, and I also became aware, because I was a keen observer of things, I became aware of some conflicts between, say, some of King's lieutenants and Abernathy and others at that time. I also believed that Jesse Jackson gave a big white lie to get us involved. He could see the restlessness of many participants because we hadn't had a demonstration. And so Jesse Jackson came in one day with a reason for one. He showed this lady's purse and said that she had been attacked by the police. And at the time and later, I always wondered, was that true? And later, I came to believe it wasn't true because I didn't see any evidence of it anywhere else. But anyway, he got about 50 of us. We went out, and this was about 4:30 on a Friday afternoon, and we lay in the streets on Constitution Avenue. So we stopped traffic. Okay. And one of the things that, to this day, that I'm almost ashamed of is that I was never arrested. So that day I was aware of it, that never had been arrested. That's not right. So I thought I would be arrested that day and, be put in jail. And I said, I can afford to, bail myself out. I don't have to be like some of the people here who don't have jobs, because many of the people just didn't have jobs. They were there or had jobs that they were only loosely tied to. But by the time we finished, there were over 75 people there, and they arrested, I don't know, about 20, 25 people, and they didn't arrest me. They dragged me out of the street 3 times, but they never arrested me. So we had our demonstration, and it was very significant because this was a seriously busy time for traffic. And so they had all, I mean, they had half the police force there to pull us out of the streets and all of that. So, um, and there was an event that happened at Resurrection City that I want to talk about. Um, Reverend James Bevel, one of Martin Luther King's lieutenants, and the person who convinced King in Birmingham to use the high school students because they were losing the Birmingham campaign. And he convinced King. And Bevel was the person who married the great Diane Nash, to one of my absolute heroes of the civil rights movement. Um, he was at this little session where we had a group of white suburban women who came to Resurrection City to look at what was going on, to figure out what they could do. So those were their questions. So they were in this little larger tent, large enough to hold about 20 or 30 people. And we were all sitting there. So I was there. And they asked Bevel, what can we do? And Bevel said, nothing can you do to help us here, but you can be of very much help to us overall, because the problem we're fighting is on the other side of your bed. So you go and take care of that, and things will work out. I argue that there was an important peg in the women's liberation movement, because nothing like had happened in D.C. before. And right after that, we had all these women who were pushing for all kinds of things, including listening to the people at Resurrection City. So I believe that it was directly related to that, much more than other people have noted. And so Resurrection City was an interesting time. I might also mention, getting even a little more personal, there was a very pretty young lady that I was dating occasionally, who was afraid to go to Resurrection City. She lived in D.C. Her mother had gone on leave from her job, to which she never returned, to help run things in Resurrection City. I've said several times that if this young lady had been like her mother, we would have been married soon. But I couldn't countenance the situation of being afraid to be where your mother is. And so her mother and I saw things pretty similarly, okay, because I've had many discussions with her. And in fact, her mother even said such things pretty much indirectly, that she needed to pay more, her daughter needed to pay more attention to me and follow me. Okay. Anyway, so this woman never went back to her job. So those are kind of sacrifices that people made. I can't say I made that one because I could go and leave IBM because I did well there and they liked me and I made them money. Okay, and so I would just go and leave when I wanted to, and I could just go back. You know, I never took off a whole week at a time, except earlier when King was killed. I took about a week and a half off, but they quickly excused that because they knew where I stood on that. Even though I never talked about such issues at the office. In fact, the Kerner Commission report was such a big deal that the IBM office I was in had it as a subject of discussion at one of our sales meetings.
How so?
Oh, it was because it was being discussed all around the country. that white racism, and here's what's wrong, and here's what we need to do. To me, I consider it the greatest book written in my lifetime. For me. I can see how other people may not think so, but to me, it was the most important book. I shouldn't say great, the most important book written in my lifetime.
Did you go to the Solidarity Day rally?
When?
During the Poor People's Campaign, there was the Solidarity Day where there was a rally with like 100,000 people.
Yes, I went.
Any memories of that?
No, because it seems to me that we were all down. I can remember a part that was near the Washington Monument, and we were all down in there, and I don't remember much else about it. I must not have been there the whole time.
I mean, historically, the Poor People's Campaign is typically called a failure. But yet in talking to people who participated, I find so many multiracial exchanges that took place that people then took back to their own communities. Can you give me a sense about how you feel personally about that campaign in '68 and what it may have accomplished?
It number one, it got attention. Okay, it did get attention. People tried to ignore it, but it got attention. So number one, and what people took back, I'm not sure. I don't know. But I didn't consider. I consider it a failure in the sense of not reaching, even pushing the goal of the anti-poverty. So I consider it a failure in that sense. In terms of activism, I don't consider it a failure, because people came anyway, said we're going to come because King asked us to come. He's no longer here, but we're coming, and then we're going to demonstrate, because, as I told you, Jesse Jackson knew that we needed to get out in the streets. We just didn't have the hundreds of thousands that King expected to be in the streets, you see. And so in that sense, it was a failure. But I'm glad it happened, so therefore I cannot consider it a failure, because I think it was a good thing for it to have occurred, and people don't know to this day that it was going on even before King was killed. They didn't know that was his main thing. They think that the Memphis garbage workers strike was the main thing. That was, as I tell people, that was a side issue, and there were many side issues that King was involved in. And to understand the Poor People's Campaign is to understand something about King. And that is that people assumed that King would come into town and says, okay, this is wrong, this shouldn't occur, we should change this, so let's go demonstrate. And that is not how it happened. I counted up one time, and I think there were 3 or 4 demonstrations that the SCLC started. Every other one that King participated in, he was called in to help, like he was called into Memphis. He was called into Albany, Georgia, and he was, way back. And that was a campaign that they actually lost in the early days of the movement. He was called in all over. In fact, he was even called to help start SNCC earlier in 1960, and he sent Ella Baker. And some people argue he sent her because she was getting in his hair, always pushing these things a little against his approach. She didn't believe in the hierarchical nature of the movement, especially just men, and so she was his director of the office, and so she was a noted civil rights leader who had come down to do that, and so he sent her over. And another person who was important in the 60s and in the 50s was involved in that, and she's seldom mentioned, And she is the person that King and the rest of us call the mother of the civil rights movement. And that was not Rosa Parks. That was Septima Clark, who recruited Ella Baker to work with her because the students had gone to her to help start SNCC. And she recruited Ella Baker to help her get it started. And so these two women actually pretty much provided a lot of the leadership to help the young folk organize to establish SNCC on April 1st, 1960. But anyway, that's the way I see it.
For young people today who are becoming active, or maybe future activists who watch this recording, do you have any particular lessons from the 60s or words of advice that you can share with them?
Yeah, the one I'll just elaborate on what I was just talking about that's the one thing. They need to really understand what happened. They need to understand that King didn't start this. He was just this person who came along at exactly the right time, was the right person to push it along and become leader. Okay, and I admire King, have no great criticism of him. But young people need to know that every town of any size had some kind of movement and some leaders trying to do things all around the country, especially in the South. Okay. And many of these leaders were heroes. Okay. And many did use Martin Luther King to come in and help. Others did it without his help. I wrote about one recently, and that was Gloria Richardson, who is, some scholars argue that her work in Cambridge, Maryland in the early 1960s pretty much laid the groundwork for the Black Power movement. And so we had placed people like her around the country, or somewhat like her. She was kind of hard to duplicate because she was such an extraordinary individual, but we had them all around. And we didn't just depend on King. So I've been saying for 50 years, they say, well, when will we have another Martin Luther King? I said, when we do what the people were doing when he came along the first time. People started the movement and King came along. If we start the movement, I argue, I guarantee you another King would emerge. It always does. That's my observation of social history, that they didn't sit down and say, when is King coming? They sit down and say, what are we going to do about this? And they would try to do something. And in many instances, King helped. In other instances, he sent people to help. But the key thing that happened before is that communities did their thing. Sometimes very well, and sometimes not so well. But most of the times, the agitation that they had produced what occurred later.
This has been an extraordinary conversation, and I feel like I could talk to you for hours. Is there anything else, any final thoughts, or anything that we've left out that you feel we should really cover as part of this?
I don't think so. I think I've covered most of the kinds of things I like to make sure that I mention in various discussions. But I guess in one thing, I go back to your last questions. What would I tell the youth? Well, one of the things I would want to tell the youth, and I try to do that often, is to talk about the 1960s. I'm saying now there are two or three things going on there that are really, really, really big. Okay, there's a Vietnam War protest that you know about, but you really don't know what you should know about the civil rights protests. And the reason I say that many people don't know about it is because in the 1960s, there was a confluence, there was a fortunate confluence of ideas that hadn't existed before and are not too strong right now. Okay, and that is something that was agreed upon from civil rights workers, civil rights leaders, congresspersons, and academics. And that was what produced the Civil Rights Bill. The most important, to me, product of that bill, other than its obvious making segregation illegal, was disparate impact. Okay, that is that we left the 1960s with the idea that racism was when there was a disparate impact of some policy or practice on minorities and women. Okay, when there was a disparate impact. And one of the things that these three groups agreed on then was that intent was irrelevant. The result is what would happen. And that's going to bring me to a second thing that I must mention, the results. Okay, and so ever since then, the anti-racial progress people have been working to reestablish intent as important. Now, intent is acknowledged to be very important in things legal, but in things social, intent is irrelevant. Something either happened or didn't. There are causes or they're not causes. Or there are these causes that are proposed or not so. So intent is irrelevant in determining whether something is racist. It's the disparate impact. Now, I want to go on record to mention one other thing dealing with results. And that goes back to Lyndon Johnson. I was at Howard University in 1965 when he gave the commencement address in a famous speech. There were several things mentioned in his speech, but there were two that stood out over everything else. One of them was all of this social science sounding stuff that had to do with the black family. And after his speech, people began to talk about it and ask him where all this come from. And of course, it came from Moynihan's report, which many scholars devoted their lives to showing that he was correct on his data but wrong on his analysis, including Wornie Reed. Okay. But that's not what I want to talk about right now. I want to talk about the other thing that he mentioned. He introduced the concepts of affirmative action. We didn't have that term then when he spoke in 1965. He said, you cannot have a race where one person is running free and another one is running with a ball and chain tied to his ankle. That's unfair. So what do? You take the ball and chain off. And then you say, run, you're free. But that's unfair. How can this person be free when it's been held back so long? We must do something to enable that person to catch up. He says, I'm not talking about equality of opportunity. I'm talking about equality of results. Until there's equality of results, these people won't be free and equal. Now, if affirmative action had been established on the basis of those comments, then I would have been for it. But as affirmative action was started, I was against it. People say, why are you against it? It sounds good. I said, look, it's being put there on weak grounds. Affirmative action is presumed to be something we do because these people need it. That's not the way Lyndon Johnson defined it, and it's not the way I define it. That you must do something to enable these people to catch up. So you must have quotas on whatever. You must do something to help them catch up. And in my view, there have only been 2 instances of real affirmative action in this country. One of them was done by Richard Nixon, of all people, with his Philadelphia plan, where he instituted the 10% set-aside, that for every contract using federal money, 10% of the contract must go to minorities and women. That lasted about 20 years or so before the anti-racial progress people, won out. So they won out in the 1990s with a series of court cases. The other instance of affirmative action working was in colleges and universities. They did things to ensure that they would increase the enrollment of blacks and other minorities. And they did whatever they could to do that. Until 1978, in the Bakke case, which pretty much eliminated, I would say, half of that, if not more, saying that you can use race, but it can't be the only thing. And so college and universities then began to use race as one of the things, but they used it very strongly. Many of them did, many college and universities. Other than that, all these other things called affirmative action are equal opportunity, what Johnson said we were not talking about. So I'll stop there.
Well, this is, as I said, been extraordinary, and I am grateful to you for being so generous with your time and contributing to this project. It's been a great honor to speak with you.
Oh, we've gone on, haven't we?
If you find yourself in Dallas at some point, it would be a great pleasure to meet you in person and show you our museum here.
Oh, okay. I guess I should add here at the end that I was on the advisory committee, the academic advisory committee, for the JFK Library in Boston.
Oh, okay. When was that?
This was in the late 1980s when I was a professor at the University of Massachusetts at Boston, which was right there. I could just walk from my office to to this place. So I mention that not often, because I never think about it, because it wasn't such a big deal in Boston, but the further I get away from Boston, the bigger the deal becomes. that when discussions about, we would meet about a couple times a year, and there would be discussions about, oh, here are our plans, what do you think of them? About academic use of the library and all of these kinds of things. And they could always say, well, we've discussed this with academics, and they say, well, this is fine, or they say we should add C to our A and B. And so it was kind of light, but it was a pleasure.